The Revenant King, Chapter 1, by Revenant. Anthony Kolinsky was terrified. In fact, he'd never felt more nervous in his life. When his father caught him as a young boy trying to sneak firecrackers into school, not a problem. When he was arrested for shoplifting in college and got kicked out, didn't bother him. When his wife came at him with a rusty kitchen knife when she found out he'd had an affair, he took care of her without breaking a sweat. Even when the police had a solid lead on his underground meth labs across Green Street, he barely lost sleep over it. Why? Because Anthony Kolinsky was cold-blooded. Everyone knew it, and everyone respected it. He'd earned the moniker Cold Blood Kolinsky because no matter how tough the situation or how tight the scenario, Anthony always managed to slither out of trouble. He had eyes and ears everywhere, and his resources were almost limitless. Even made men called him Mister. Anthony lived a lucrative and risky life, but it was that life that made him infamous, powerful, and fearless. But now Anthony was on the verge of a nervous breakdown. In his luxurious apartment in Manhattan, where he could view the city from above, a beer bottle in hand and a cigar in his fingers, he'd grin and watch as the cars moved aimlessly along between the maze of buildings, streets, and alleys. To him, Manhattan was less of a city or metropolis and more a business opportunity or a bank. It amused him to watch the pieces move and see which parts he could reach out and touch and take from. But now he had the windows shut tight, the curtains drawn across them, and outside of his bedroom door were two armed men with agitated and tired expressions. He sat in his bed, pajamas on and sweat drenching his gray hair as it matted to his balding head. His eyes darted about the room, leaping at every shadow, frightened of every flutter. The pounding of his heart in his ears itself was messing with him. "Freddy!" he shouted suddenly. "Yes, sir? How are things out there? Anything?" "Nothing, sir. It's all clear." Good. He lay back down and tried to calm himself. Nothing would happen. Nothing would come. It had all started a week ago when one of his drug distributors had been found dead. His body hung upside down as blood drained from his throat, a message stuffed in his mouth. The message had been very specifically meant for Anthony, who, upon reading it, found the chilling text say, "You have 1 week, Kolinsky. Turn yourself in, or I come for you. Signed, the Count." Kolinsky had almost laughed at the threat. How ridiculous. This was ludicrous. His distributor was a weakling, a no one. It didn't matter if one was axed off, he'd just hire a new one. He never took it to heart and made sure that nothing could be found on the body that linked anything back to him. But the next morning, he received word that one of his drug storage houses had been hit. Only 4 men had survived and 1 woman. All of them were pale as sheets, shaking in fear, claiming that some shadow had come. Nothing but screams. They tried shooting the attacker, but it was like shooting a ghost. They hit nothing, and there was nothing but blood. So much blood. It was like a sprinkler of red blood had been let off in the house. And tucked in the pocket of one of the dead dealers was another note. "Don't think I can't find you, Kolinsky. Each day you stall, I hit another one of your houses. The blood doesn't stop here. Signed, the Count." Now this got Kolinsky furious. He doubled the guard at every one of his distribution centers. He made sure enforcers were aware of the new threat. He maxed out production of drugs and heroin as fast as he could without raising suspicion. If this lunatic wanted to play hero, then he'd suffer for it. The next morning, one of his informants was found in his safe house, barely alive, his body shaking in terror and mumbling something about horrible red eyes. He was taken to a hospital and treated for shock and several lacerations all over his body. When Kolinsky came to visit him, all the young man said was, He wants you. He wants you." Now, Kolinsky was a little concerned. He had all of his men switch safe houses and move their production plants. Any unaccounted for plants or product had to be found and moved. This attacker knew too much, and he was out for blood. Another morning, and to Kolinsky's horror, another hit. But this time was way closer to home. It was becoming frightening, and even Kolinsky's iron will was starting to waver. Who was it? How did they keep finding him? And why were his armed enforcers, paid well, unable to even touch the bastard? All they would say was that they would see shadows moving, red eyes, and then blood. Gah! Kolinsky cried. He'd heard something tap his window. The cry brought Freddy and Amarian into the room. Both had guns raised. What is it? What's wrong? Kolinsky pointed to the window and they ran to it, throwing open the curtains. There was nothing. Nothing but empty night and the lights of the buildings beyond. A single bat was flapping around aimlessly in the night, searching for moths. Freddy chuckled and shook his head. Just a bat hitting the window, boss. No big deal. You're sure? Yeah, man, it ain't no big thing, Amarian added. Jumping at shadows, man. Shut it! Kolinsky hissed. I got good reason to jump at shadows. Go back outside and leave me be. The two men shrugged and walked back out the door, closing it behind him. As he lay back on his bed, he heard another tap and glanced out to see the bat again. Damn rodent! Get lost! He turned to grab his pistol to shoot the thing. But the moment he turned to the door again, there was no bat. Only a shadowy figure standing outside his balcony. Fear gripped Kolinsky like a grasping claw, seeking to rip out his soul. He let out a shriek and aimed his gun at the figure, only for it to vanish like it had never been there. He looked around frantically for a solution. How had it gotten on his top-floor balcony in the first place? Freddy! Amarian, get in here, you useless bastards! There was no sound from outside. Not even a cough. Do you hear me? They won't come. The voice spoke with a deep but dignified manner that reminded Anthony Kolinsky of a suave aristocrat. There was the slightest hint of an accent, though the voice oozed with a dark malice that was familiar to Kolinsky, no matter the language. He spun around to see again, and the figure was now inside his room, just past the window barrier. His clothes were odd. He wore a black leather jacket with a hood over his head to hide his face, though he could make out strands of black hair. He had on fitted jeans and fine boots on his feet. He appeared like a simple person off the streets, but there was a sophistication to him. He stood straight with squared shoulders, as if standing at attention in the military. Though he wore a leather jacket and hood, it looked expensive. In fact, it looked very professional, and yet of the urban environment at the same time. A strange and unnerving combination of grungy and professional. Perhaps it was the way he stood and composed himself. His hands were behind his back, clasping each other. Though he couldn't see the man's eyes, Anthony could feel a pair of eyes glaring at him. Coldly. How the hell did you get in here? How indeed? The stranger asked. Forgive me, but that doesn't seem the appropriate question you should ask at this moment. His manner of speech was refined and polite, but with a hint of venom in his voice. I believe the better question to ask would be, what will you do now that I am here? The manner in which I got here is irrelevant. I am here regardless of my means. So what will you do, cold-blooded Kolinsky? Anthony was at a loss for words. This murderer was just having a conversation with him. It was as if nothing had happened in the last week. He spoke the way one might discuss a day at work or a family vacation. Anthony slowly reached for his handgun, which had fallen on the bed. That's something I'm considering at this moment, you freak! Where's Freddy and Amarian? You bribed them? Your subordinates are asleep, the intruder answered. They will remain that way until I leave. But let's not worry about them. We have another pressing matter. What is it you want? What I want, the figure asked. Kolinsky froze, his hand only inches from his gun. He could grab it. Shoot. He could blow this man to kingdom come. But something made him stop. He wanted to hear. He wanted to get a peek into who he was dealing with. The intruder sighed, and he seemed to stare off into space a moment. What I want, he repeated. What I want is not something I can ever obtain. It is as the stars, forever beyond reach, yet always within sight. But my desires are not important. He pulled a flipped cell phone and tossed it at Kolinsky, who caught it and stared at it a moment, curious. You will call the police and turn yourself in. This is your only chance. Refuse, and I will dispense my own justice." The stranger hissed. Kolinsky finally moved and snatched up the gun, aiming at the figure and unloading the entire magazine into the stranger's chest. All bullets found their mark, and the young man hit the ground hard as blood gushed from his wounds. "Fucking trash! You fucked with the wrong guy!" he snapped, turning to Colin, Amarian, and Freddy. As he walked to the door, he heard movement and spun around. Kolinsky was a man valued for his tough exterior and ability to face any problem with bravery and collectedness. But now he was on the verge of pissing his pants. The figure he had just shot dead in his bedroom was now getting back up, his wounds closing themselves as the bullets harmlessly fell out. "So, can I take that as a no?" the figure asked. "What the fuck?" He moved with such speed Kolinsky couldn't even react as he was thrust against a wall and held there by the stranger's hand, nearly crushing his windpipe as he clutched his throat menacingly. "I'm actually pleased that you declined my offer, Anthony. Resourceful and connected scum like you could manage your operations even in a jail cell, couldn't you? You're a cancerous growth on a society, and nothing short of removal will cure the disease." Kolinsky kicked and tried to scream, but only managed a single choking phrase. "Who the fuck are you?" The stranger smiled, and at last Anthony could make out more about him. He removed his hood to reveal a young face, possibly in its mid to late 20s. He had black hair, slightly messy from the hood but cut short. There was the beginning of stubble of a beard on his chin and under his nose, but that was where the normal attributes of a man would end. His eyes were crimson red like a circle of hell, and when he smiled, his canine teeth were long and sharper than the rest, revealing the pointed, menacing fangs. The refined way he stood and acted, the cold and haunting stare he gave, the refined but bloodthirsty tone of voice, and the fangs dripping with intent. The young man merely smiled as he gave a polite bow of his head. "I am Dracula. It is a pleasure, Anthony Kolinsky. And now if you'll excuse me, I'd like to see if your blood is truly as cold as I have heard." The last sound that could be heard from Anthony Kolinsky's apartment was the sound of a blood-curdling scream, and then silence. When the police investigated the apartment the next day, they found a corpse on the ground, drained of blood, and with a stake through his heart. On his chest, taped to the stake, was a letter written in very fine calligraphy, and it read, "I am the Revenant King. While I reign, the wicked will find only death perched upon their rooftops with brooding wings. Let them fear the dark in which they hide, for their shelter shall become their tomb. Signed, Count Dracula."